Welcome to the presentation of the Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism. The highly competitive national award is presented annually by the Donald P. Belisario College of Communications at Penn State. The award recognizes distinguished contributions to the improvement of print and broadcast journalism through responsible analysis or critical evaluation. Previous winners represent a who's who of some of the nation's most respected journalists and media outlets. The award is named for Bart Richards, a journalist with a long and distinguished career at the Newcastle News in Pennsylvania. Richards, who was born in 1893 in Pittsburgh, found his love of journalism during World War I, when he served as a columnist and associate editor of the newspaper at Camp Hancock, Georgia. After the war, he returned home to Newcastle and started working at the local paper. He crafted a reputation for a commitment to ethics and responsible community journalism. He was also a dogged reporter, once tracking the story of a suspect in a murder trial across state lines and borrowing a competitor's typewriter to file the story before anyone else. Richards advanced from a general assignment reporter to editor during his career. He served as president of the United Press International Editors of Pennsylvania and earned the Distinguished Service Award from the Pennsylvania Newspaper Publishers Association. A community-minded servant leader, Richards was elected to the Pennsylvania General Assembly 3 times, helped organize the local American Legion, and was chairman of the Lawrence County Parks and Recreation Board. Richards also wrote 3 books on local history, 2 books of poetry, and broadcast a radio series. Richards and his wife Ann had 2 children, son George and daughter Ann. George, a Penn State graduate, provided the endowment to name the Bart Richards Award for his father in 1994. Now, please welcome Dean Marie Harden of the Belisario College.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me to honor the 2020 winner of the Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism, which recognizes contributions to the improvement of journalism through responsible analysis and evaluation. This award ceremony always comes at a great time, just after we've wrapped up the academic year and we have time to reflect on our work as journalism educators and on the journalism landscape more generally. It's important that we do so, especially when so many Americans indicate mistrust of an institution that we know is essential for democracy. Over the years, we've honored some of the finest work in media criticism, such as that done by Neiman Reports, On the Media, Frontline, the New York Times, and CNN, among others. We always have great entries that are submitted for this award, and this year was no exception. Our expert judges, as always, did the very difficult work of going through our entries to choose the best. Thank you to Tony Barbieri, former managing editor of the Baltimore Sun and retired Foster Professor of Journalism here in the college. Thanks also to Mark Russell, executive editor at the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Tennessee, and to Cheryl Fair, president and general manager of KABC in Los Angeles, for your work as judges. I think this year's winner will provide the perfect conversation to prompt our thinking on the important issues the news industries face today. And on a personal level, I'm really excited to introduce her, as I've been a reader and a follower of her work. I'm also finishing her recent and important book, Ghosting the News. You will learn more about her career history in just a moment, a trajectory that I hope many of our students are able to follow to have the impact she has had. She's not only an accomplished journalist, but also a leader in the industry and a teacher. She twice served as director of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and she has taught journalism at both Columbia and the City University of New York. Now, let's hear more about her story and her work. Congratulations and welcome to Margaret Sullivan.
I'm really thrilled to receive the Bart Richards Award from Penn State. It's really an incredible honor, and it has made me really happy at a time when, you know, we need some things to make us happy because it has been a difficult time. So I'm very appreciative of it. School is so renowned, and The judges are wonderful people and great journalists, and it's just great all around. So thank you very much for the honor. And I thought I would talk a little bit about how I came to do this particular kind of work, because I don't think that little children wake up one day and say, "Mom and Dad, I'd like to be a media columnist." It is kind of a peculiar job. So I thought I'd talk about that just a little bit, and then about some of the columns that I've done, including some of the columns that were in the body of work that was recognized. So actually, almost all of my quite lengthy career has been at the Buffalo News, which is my hometown. And I came there as a summer intern straight out of Northwestern's Medill School. I had gone to Georgetown undergrad, and I went to Medill in Chicago, got my master's. And this is just a quick little story, but one that I think is kind of fun. So I came out of Medill, and I had internship offers at the two newspapers in Buffalo, which were the Buffalo Evening News, as it was known then, now the Buffalo News, and the Buffalo Courier Express. So I asked my dad, a lawyer, what he thought I should do. And he deliberated for a moment and said, he said, "I think the News is the dominant paper." So I went to work for the News, and I got a job offer at the end of the summer and became a full-time business reporter. And 2 years later, the Courier Express, very sadly, was out of business. But apparently, Dad was correct in thinking that it was the dominant paper and that it would be the one to endure. And then I stayed there for 3 decades. So I did a lot of different jobs there. I covered a lot of different beats. I was on the city desk as an editor. I was the features editor for a long time. I married someone in the newsroom. And I eventually, and to my great honor, was named the first woman editor of the paper. And it was a thrill and a great privilege. And I always thought, well, if obituaries are still around when I die, I'm pretty sure that the first line of my obituary will be that I was the first female editor of the Buffalo News, my hometown paper. And I was very honored to do that job. And it went reasonably well. I did it for 12 or 13 years. And, but then I did have another chapter, a pretty different chapter after that. I had thought for a long time that the jobs of ombudsman at the Washington Post and public editor at the New York Times were really fascinating. And I thought I would be good at those jobs. Neither one of which, by the way, exists anymore. But the public editor job did come open in 2011 or 2012. And I saw that Art Brisbane, who was the public editor, was not going to come back for another couple of years, and that the job was open. I read it in Eric Wemple's blog, as a matter of fact, which I always give Eric great credit for. And I applied for the job. I really wanted to do it. It was at a time of my life. I was single again. My daughter was at NYU, so in New York. My son was in law school on the East Coast, so that was good. And it worked out. And I did do that very peculiar job of public editor, which is, as everybody here probably knows, the reader representative and sort of an internal critic, something some people refer to as the worst job in journalism, because of, there's this kind of tension, or you're criticizing your colleagues and all of that. But it was a great experience for me. I grew a lot. I felt really well prepared for it because I had done all these different jobs at a newspaper, and I felt actually very comfortable there, maybe more comfortable than I should have felt, but whatever. I was well along in my career. I felt like I could do it. And I really did it in a much more digital way than had been done before. I was very active on the Public Editor's Journal blog. I was active on Twitter. And I think that was transformative for the role of public editor. So I'm proud of that. And also the issues that I took up, the overuse of anonymous sources, for example, some of the some of the problems that we are now seeing crop up in bigger ways, some of the, coverage of race and gender, those were sort of starting to come to the surface, and I was able to do work that I was proud of there. So, the Times did ask me to stick around longer after my 4-year stint, but I was starting to feel a little bit too much like an insider, and you're supposed to be an outsider in that job. So I actually had a conversation with Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post at that time, until recently, obviously. And I kind of pitched him on a job similar to what David Carr had done at the New York Times. And David had passed away by then. And Marty was interested, but Marty being Marty, he didn't do anything like, okay, you're hired. It was, I had to jump through many hoops and go through the entire process and, make sure every editor talked to me. And that was actually a very good thing. So I've been at the Post since 2016. And, now I guess I can sort of segue into what I've been doing and the kinds of columns I've been writing. So, I came in 2016 and almost immediately I went to the 2 political conventions in Cleveland and Philadelphia. And I have to say that since then, up until recently, the beat of media columnist, or I don't know whether it's really a beat, but the media beat has been very dominated by Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the candidate, and then Donald Trump, the president, and actually still in his ex-presidency somewhat too. Obviously a very important figure to the media, the whole attacks on the media that he made, the way he disparaged our work, the way he was covered, all of these things gave me a lot of fodder for columns, and I did a lot of Trump columns. Many of them were critical of the way the news media was seeming to, not know how to cover him. As he was breaking the norms, we were struggling with our own norms. And so that there was a lot of tension there that made for some, I hope it made for some good columns, but it certainly made for some interesting subject matter. So, when I sit down to think about what my next column is going to be, there are obviously always a lot of choices because there's so much going on in the media world. There's been the whole growth of social media. There's been what's happening with conservative or right-wing media and how Fox News figures into that. There's been what's happened, the withering of local newspapers and the coming of nonprofits in local. So obviously a lot of choices. And I try to think about what could be of service, actually. I mean, maybe it sounds a little idealistic or sentimental or something, but with all the choices that there are, I do try to think about, like, what could I do that actually would be useful here? And I also try very hard to pitch my column at regular readers. I don't see myself writing for, the media crowd, although I think a lot of journalists follow me or read my columns, and I'm very pleased about that, but that's not who I really have in mind. Who I have in mind are people who are curious about the way the news media works and would like to understand it more and probably have some pretty strong opinions about it. And may have some strong political opinions. And the other thing I found out at the Washington Post is that so much of what you do is filtered through national politics. I mean, it is just such a dominant force at the Post. It's the Post's great strength. The Post has many strengths, but that's certainly one of them. And so I had to kind of recalibrate and think in those terms a little bit more. So, that's kind of what I've been up to. And when it came time to put together, a body of work for this competition, I was really pleased that while I did have some Trump columns, and I have not been a fan of the way he's treated the press, and I think he's done a lot of damage to the American public's trust in the news media. And, I did not appreciate his disparaging remarks towards journalists of color, particularly women of color, a lot of things. So there were some Trump columns in the mix, but I also had one that was critical of President Obama because of the way he used the Espionage Act in pursuing leakers, and in the course of pursuing leakers, going after journalists, in effect setting a blueprint for anyone who wanted to use the Espionage Act, which really was never intended for that purpose. And I thought that President Obama had checkered somewhat inconsistent approach and record on press rights. So, equal opportunity. I was happy to have that in the mix. And I also had one looking forward, looking ahead to President Biden's relationship with the press and how press rights could be treated in his administration. So early days here still, but I gave that some thought. I also wrote 2 columns about local news. I had written a book this past year published a book in 2020 called Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy, about how when local news dwindles or withers or even goes away, that democracy is directly affected because people become more polarized in their voting. They become less trusting, and they really lose out on a lot as citizens. So I was able to write a couple columns that were related to that, not related to the book per se, but one about how we just can't lose local journalism. It's just too important. And another one about some of the bright spots I was starting to see, which was good, but I don't know that it's really enough to cover for what we've lost. But I was glad to put some attention in that column on a collaboration between Mississippi Today, which is a startup, all digital startup, and I believe a nonprofit, and its collaboration with the Marshall Project, which takes up issues having to do with criminal justice. So they were able to work together to do a really great project. And that's sort of how it led off, that this is, here's the new world. And my feeling is that we need to absolutely encourage those new things and celebrate them, but not forget that some of the best work is still being done by local newspapers. I mean, I actually am amazed that although papers have had to cut their staff so in such a draconian way, that they're still managing to do so much important work. So I was glad to be able to call some attention to that. And then I also wrote one that I, really have some strong personal feelings about, which has to do with sort of a news judgment mistake that I made when I was the editor in Buffalo about a crime that was committed, and some coverage that we did that I ultimately felt was victim blaming, and which caused people in the Black community of Buffalo to be very upset. I had gone to, after that happened and after they were obviously so upset, I went to a community meeting with 700 people and really, heard them out in terms of what they thought. And it wasn't just about that coverage, but about sort of the whole history of the paper's relationship with the Black community. And we ended up doing a lot of remedial work, I guess I would say, or making some amends to the Black community in terms of our coverage, in terms of training that we did in our newsroom, meeting with people. We really took a very energetic approach to fixing things. And I feel like in this moment when people make mistakes and don't necessarily get a chance to recover from them, that I wanted to write about the second chance I got to, if not make it right, at least show some goodwill. And in doing the column, I interviewed a Black minister, Darius Pridgeon, who I had originally gone out to meet with his congregation, and it was his church where this big meeting took place. So I caught up with Reverend Pridgeon, who is now the head of the Buffalo Common Council. He's the Common Council president. And we kind of reminisced about what had happened. And he was very gracious in saying that he felt like it was a healing moment, not the coming out to the church and talking to people, but what happened afterwards. So, to be honest, it's a column that still, really causes me to be somewhat embarrassed and to feel like it was such a mistake, and to also feel very, very fortunate that I got a chance to recover from it. So, again, at a time when everything is so punitive that, I don't know, it was a number of years ago now, maybe a decade ago, and I don't know really what would happen now. So, so I got a chance to do some reflection on that and put it out there with some trepidation, and actually enter it in the awards contest with some trepidation. So I was glad that it was well received, and it was well received generally, I think, too. So that's kind of the short version of what I'm up to. I'm still really compelled by the field that we're in, which I've been in for, I actually was the editor of my high school newspaper. It's the only thing I ever have done, and the only thing I've ever really wanted to do in terms of professional activity or creative activity. And, it's a fantastic field. When young journalists ask me now, is there room for me in this field, and what should I do, and can I really do it? I give them the examples of 3 young people I know. One of them happens to be a Penn State graduate, journalism graduate, Allie Ingersoll, who's working at WRAL now in Raleigh. And my nephew, whose name is Peter Sullivan, who covers healthcare for The Hill on Capitol Hill. And a young woman named Sophie Kleeman, who was my daughter's NYU roommate. Sophie works at Business Insider as the essays editor. And they've all had, what would have been unimaginable careers, I guess, to varying degrees. Back when I was coming up, it was sort of, move from one paper to another, or stay at one paper and change jobs. But I'm really proud of all of them. They're doing great. They're paying the rent. They're doing work that matters, all in different places, TV, sort of Washington coverage, and digital, essays and commentary. So they've all found their place, and it's not been a particularly easy road for all of them, but they've gotten there. And so I feel like if students and young journalists are really passionate about wanting to be journalists, and they're talented, of course, and they catch a break now and then, that they can actually make it in this field. And we need good people. So I try not to be negative about it, even though I am worried about the field at the same time. So, that's sort of my story.
You shared an incredible story, and really with a lot of candor and humility, in one of the columns that was part of this winning group of columns for this award. And it was about that mistake that you made in covering an event in the Black community in Buffalo years ago. And I guess my question for you is, what are the lessons in that story for newsrooms today?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for all of this and for the award. And I'm more than happy to answer that question. I think I said earlier that I was apprehensive even putting it in my body of work that I entered, because I still feel very sensitive about it. And I know that people in Buffalo still do too, although I think a lot of healing has happened, as the column reflected. The lessons for now, I think, are that we have to, if we're going to make something right or even approach making it right, we have to do more than just say, I'm sorry, or yeah, we probably could have done better with that. We have to actually make some amends and make some changes, and they have to be real. So, what we did in our newsroom, in the newsroom I ran in Buffalo, I mean, this story was not something I wrote. It was something that I put in the paper and I supervised. Was, we did a lot of training, including for myself, but for all of key editors and reporters. We changed our coverage. We invited people in to meet with us on a regular basis and had an ad hoc, or more than ad hoc, a regular advisory council. So we really kind of changed the way we behaved. And I think that that is really important to do. But I also feel like very lucky in the sense that, I feel these days not everybody gets a chance to recover from mistakes. So I was very glad that I was able to.
Well, I'm glad you shared that lesson with us. I think a lot of people now can benefit from reading that column. So thank you for doing that. Something else that you talked about is this idea of the fact that you're not writing for what you call the media crowd, that you're writing for people who are curious about how the news media works. And I guess with that in mind, what do you think the average reader who's seeking your column, what do they generally need to understand about the news industry today?
Well, I think that people who will read a column about journalism or the press or the media are already, probably halfway there. They're already interested and curious. I think they like to know what happens behind the scenes, to the extent that you can pull back the curtain a little bit and say, this is how it works. So, I have always felt that transparency was such an important value. It's such an important way to earn and keep trust between a news organization and the people that we're covering, or the people who are in our audience or our readership. So, but I also think there's quite a bit of distrust and mistrust now about bias, about how we go about doing what we're doing, about whether we are actually political partisans. What is it? What do we still have a sense of neutrality and impartiality? And, these are values that to some extent are changing a little bit. It's not sort of the old school way. And in some ways, we are a little bit more willing to say, yes, we stand for something. And I think it's okay to say that we stand for certain things like civil rights. I think it's okay to say we stand for press rights. And, but when we do that and we come out of our very sort of neutral shell a little bit, I think we have to keep explaining ourselves to people and keep trying to show that even though we may have some feelings about certain kinds of things, like racism, for example, like press rights, that we are still able to cover stories and to give coverage in a fair way. And I find that fair is a good word. I like the word fair a little bit more than I like the word objective, which comes with all kinds of baggage attached to it.
So interesting you say that, because I was waiting for you to use that word. And you talked about, notions of fairness and independence and things like that. But I was curious to know how you, what you think of the notion of objectivity, and is that notion no longer, is that idea an idea that we should no longer be thinking about or aspiring to?
I don't like to put it that way at all, because I think that, people do, in our audiences and our readership, do feel strongly that they want journalists to come into something with a sense of fairness, and that they're going to get a fair shake from them. So, I think that when we say objective, sometimes that can sort of devolve into something that's not so good, which is that we give equal weight to things that shouldn't be equal. Sometimes people think that objective means, well, we're going to give 50% to everything, each story. And if we have a story about climate change, or as it's being called now, the climate emergency, maybe people who have an old school idea of objectivity would say, well, we should give 50% of this story to people who don't believe that climate change is happening. 50% of a story about that says that the earth is flat. Some things don't deserve 50%. But I think if we approach stories and approach coverage from a sense of being fair to those involved and fair to our readership and wanting to give them the straight story, that's a better approach. And, I think we also have to acknowledge that everything we do in journalism is a choice. The way we frame a story, what we decide to cover, what we decide to put what headline is going to be on it, what photo is going to be with it. It's not as if there's some sort of, objectivity checklist, because everything is framing, everything is a choice. So it's pretty tricky terrain these days, and there's a lot of strong feelings about this. But I think we have to be careful not to fall into the different traps about it, which can be this kind of, what people now call, false equivalency, or some people will call it, you're both sidesing that. They've turned it into a verb. And that doesn't mean we don't listen to various parties. It just means not everything is equal.
As I'm hearing you, I immediately start thinking about when you talk about fairness and journalists having to make really important judgments, right, about how to fairly cover a story. It seems to me that then diversity in the newsroom becomes even more important.
It really does. And I mean, this is something that I feel something I have felt very strongly about for many years, and probably going back to that Buffalo incident that I wrote about, when I caught up with the Black minister whose church I had gone to meet with people, he said that something that swayed him so much when I walked into that meeting was that, many members of the newsroom came with me, and many members of senior newsroom leaders came with me, and I had a really diverse newsroom at that point. And I didn't ask them to come. They decided to come because they felt strongly and they wanted to support me and they wanted to show up. And he said that when he saw that, he got a different feeling about how things might go. So that's just one tiny example, but really where it matters is in our coverage. Are we going to be able to really represent all the different parts of the communities that we're covering if we're all one thing? If we're, for example, if we were all men, or if we were all Democrats, or if we were all, white. Mm-hmm. I think we do have to have some different voices, because our country and our communities are diverse, and we want to be able to reflect that.
Absolutely. And of course you have, you built a track record in Buffalo for diversifying your newsroom. And
I'm so appreciative of all the people that I was able to hire and the work they did, because I could see in their work, it wasn't just, numbers. It wasn't just for a spreadsheet or a report to some national organization, but actually in the story ideas they had and in the work that they did.
That's great. That's wonderful in terms of just making sure that we think about all of the ways that our news stories are impacted by forces inside and outside the newsroom. I want to turn to your columns in 2020 that looked at Trump, Biden, and Obama.
Yes.
Right? You wrote about all three. And I guess my question for you right out of the gate is, how much difference can a president make in terms of the way journalists are treated and understood by the American public? And are those changes, if you do think there is a big impact, and I think that's an argument that you might make. How can that be changed? Can that be reversed?
Well, Trump, as I think we all know, had an adversarial relationship with the press. But one of the reasons I included in my columns that I submitted a column about President Obama's record with the press is that he had far from a perfect record of supporting press rights. And in some ways, he laid out a blueprint that could be followed by future presidents about using the Espionage Act in a way that is not friendly to press rights, and in fact could be very punitive, and was in some cases. And then in terms of President Biden, the column I wrote there was, how can he be a president who supports press rights, and what can he do to sort of help repair some of this damage? But to answer your question directly, I do think that President Trump did damage to people's, if you look at the population at large. Yes, we have many people who appreciate the role of the press and appreciate the reporting that was done, including by my colleagues at the Washington Post. But when you have a president for years, not only in office, but before he was in office and after, who is, excuse me, who is disparaging the press at every turn, then I think it has an effect. I mean, the president has such a bully pulpit and is able to really, to some extent, form public opinion. So when he uses expressions or used expressions like fake news, charging that actual journalists or news organizations themselves, he would say to people like Jim Acosta, you are fake news, not just what you're producing, but you yourself are fake news. Or when he called the press the enemy of the American people. I do think it's very damaging. And where we see it show up is in foreign leaders who start using that kind of language or use it more. And we start seeing it make its way to the local level, where mayors and congressmen and people like that start saying to their local journalists, that's all, if there's a story that they don't like, or there's coverage that holds their feet to the fire, oh, that's nothing but fake news. So I think that this kind of mimicry is pretty bad. And can it be reversed? I think it's going to take a lot of work to reverse it. I think we have a lot of work to do as journalists and honestly as citizens to get to a point where there's a reasonable kind of trust among the parties.
You talked about local journalism, so I want to circle back around to that. And that is, you've literally written the book about it, Ghosting the News, and I would highly recommend that book. Can you talk about the contrast that I think we're seeing, where Americans generally distrust the media, yet we also see that they express a higher trust in local news, local coverage. And I'm wondering why is that?
Well, I think with local coverage, for example, with your local TV station or your local newspaper, you might actually know those people who are on the screen or writing this on the byline, writing the story. You might run into them in your supermarket, or maybe their children go to school with your children, something like that. There's a real community sort of togetherness there. And I also think that there's just more clear accountability, because if someone's reporting on something that about, the wastewater treatment facility that's nearly in your backyard, and they get it wrong, it's not a question. So also there's this measurement when people do polls about the media and trust in the media, there's always this sort of split. There's the media, and then there's my media. And my media tends to be more trusted. In other words, let's just say I listen to NPR and I read the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I go online to Spotlight, PA. Well, I have quite a bit of, I may have quite a bit of trust there. But if you talk to me about the media, and now suddenly we're including, cable news, whichever cable news I don't happen to like, or whatever it may be, then, I think there's a deeper distrust there. I mean, the really tough thing about this local news situation is we need more trust, and we have it with local news. And yet, at least with newspapers, the business model is really failing. And it's such a challenge. I mean, I do see some good things happen, and some of them are in fact happening in Pennsylvania. So that's great to see. Some of the best work, the Lenfest Institute and Spotlight PA and some of the other collaborations that are happening in Pennsylvania are really, really heartening and are a model for the rest of the country.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Spotlight PA and the Lenfest Institute, which leads me to my next question, which is talk about how does journalism at the local and regional level need to be funded? Any ideas there?
Well, it's really tricky. There's always been this feeling that we cherish our independence, and that's where our credibility comes from. We can't be bought. And so the idea of direct government funding, not that anyone is really seeming to be offering that right now, but the idea of seeking direct government funding, it has always been kind of a third rail. Gee, do we really want to go there? But there are some things that could change. For example, newspapers could be given more ability to have an even playing field against the Googles and Facebooks of the world in terms of getting digital advertising, because Google and Facebook just eat it all up, and it leaves publishers who are kind of off on their own without a leg to stand on. But if they could work together a little bit more, and there are efforts to give them a temporary antitrust exemption so that they can work together and at least have a little bit more leverage there. But, the other forms of funding, depending on what it is, if it's a nonprofit news organization, a digital startup, a digital investigative site, oftentimes the funding there is philanthropy or is membership or some combination or events or all three. And so I think we have to be a lot more creative. We just can't rely on what used to be so literally foolproof, which was print advertising. It came in the door and great, there it was. I mean, when I was at the Buffalo News for many years, we made $1 million profit a week. We sent $1 million to Berkshire Hathaway, our owner under Warren Buffett. And, but when that went away, it really went away fast, and it's not coming back.
Yeah. Really, big problems, big challenges for local news. But speaking of local news, we have students in the Belisario College, and I want to turn the last few minutes over to thinking about the questions I know our students have. And these students are going to be graduating in hopes of getting that first job in journalism. Oftentimes that is in local news. So the namesake, I want to mention the namesake for this award. His name is, of course, Bart Richards. He was a longtime local newspaper editor here in Pennsylvania, and he had a reputation for being fearless, creative, and persistent, which seemed to me like great traits for a journalist even today. My question for you on behalf of Belisario students is, what other qualities, what are the great qualities that you think journalists need to have today as they head out into newsrooms?
Well, certainly those qualities no one could argue with, and I second those. But I also think we have to have two other things I would mention. One is kind of an endless curiosity. Our world is changing so fast that it is really important for us to be constantly learning and constantly curious. So there's no way to sort of say, well, I cover X beat, I cover education or something like that, and I'm just going to do it for 20 years. It just doesn't work that way anymore. We really have to be changing along with the times and be constantly learning and constantly curious. And then the other one, I think, is compassion, and really to be thinking about the people we cover and the people we write for or broadcast to or talk to, and how can we best serve them, and how can we best meet their needs, and what are their lives like? So I guess I would add those two. There's probably many more, but those are two that come to mind right now.
Well, those seem really important for students who are going to be graduating into the journalism field. One thing that you did in your comments, again, that I really appreciated was you talked about three journalists that you've been in touch with over the years, one of them a Penn State graduate, and seeing their resilience and the way they adapted. I just want to, as a final question to you on behalf of our students, I'd love for you to just share what would be, sort of a bit of advice to them as they seek to follow the kind of success that you've had over many years in journalism.
Well, I think that it's really important to know that, keep in touch with what a great, important, really noble field this is. And know at the same time, it's not an easy field, and it never has been. It's about as much fun as you can have at a job, I'm convinced, but it's never been easy, and I think that in this difficult environment, it's really important to stay true to your own values and to realize that I'm going to probably have some tough times, maybe some tough years. They are inevitable these days. And also, I just would add, because I know that, I've certainly made my share of mistakes and learned from them. And, I think you have to be willing to acknowledge those mistakes and learn from them and recover from them and move on. Because the truth is, you really do learn way more from your mistakes if you're allowed to recover from them than you ever will from, the great front page byline or even the great award. It's the, I don't know whether I'd go so far as to call them failures, but it's the tough times that actually help you the most. So stay strong and stay with it, because the field needs great young journalists, and you'll never be sorry that you are, if you're able to do it, you'll never be sorry about that.
That's great advice to finish off this conversation. And I just want to thank you so much. Again, I've been an admirer of yours. It's very exciting to have this conversation with you. We are so fortunate that you join our esteemed roster of winners of this award. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. I'm actually just want to express that I'm so appreciative, so thrilled to have the Bart Richards Award. It comes, the list of people and institutions who've gotten it are just terrific. And I really do feel very privileged and very lucky and very grateful. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I recommend to everyone, if you're not following Margaret Sullivan, to follow her work, to read her work. I think it's very important. I'm going to recommend her book again because I think it's also so important. Thanks everyone for joining us, and stay in touch.